All right, so welcome everybody. I'd like to first extend a generous welcome to all of the scholars and globetrotters that are joining us here tonight, and to thank you all for attending the 2024 Molina Foundation Osler Library Medical Student Awards, whether you're joining us in person or online. My name is Yoel, and having been a recipient of the awards last year, it's my pleasure to be moderating our program tonight. We have three thought-provoking presentations touching on the intersection of medicine with policy and prejudice. Our session is set to end around 5:30 p.m., after which we invite you to join us upstairs for the 47th Annual Osler Lectureship. For those unaware, the Molina Foundation Awards are an opportunity for medical students to undertake a research project using the Osler Library's resources, and it serves as a reminder to us that there's more to medicine than just treating disease. Medicine carries with it a rich history with cultural implications for our lives today, and we hope that our presentations tonight will foster some discussion in that regard. Now, before we begin the night, some ground rules. To ensure that we stay on track, presentations will be limited to 15 minutes. I'll be timing the presentations in the back. When you have 5 minutes left, I'll give a wave, and when you have 1 minute left, I'll give a wave. All right? Followed by the presentation, there'll be a 5-minute question period. Any further discussions, which we encourage, could be done in the break between this session and the Osler Lectureship, or if you're joining us at the banquet, we'll be sure to have some lively discussions there. So, without further ado, we'll begin with the first presentation of the evening by Megan Brody. Megan is a third-year medical student with a passion for reading, writing, and the humanities. She was awarded first place in last year's Pam and Rolando Del Maestro Family Osler Essay Competition for her work on palliative care and euthanasia. This year, her Molina project is entitled Justifying Judgment: How Canadian Temperance Textbooks Use Medicine to Teach Morality. Megan? Now we transfer the microphone.
So it's up to you if you want to clip it off.
I can clip it.
Or you can,
Is this good?
yeah. Well,
This work?
it should be pointing. So that's the mic. So it's not even pointing now, but if it stays. If not, this is.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yes? Okay. I'm just going to start off. My presentation is longer than 15 minutes. I initially thought we had 20 minutes when I was preparing, so if there's no time for Q&A, we can save it for afterwards. So thank you all for the introduction. My name is Megan. I'm a third-year medical student here. Today I'll be presenting my Molina project titled Justifying Judgment: How Canadian Temperance Textbooks Use Medicine to Teach Morality. Before I get started, I just want to extend some thank yous. First of all, to Dr. Molina for making this scholarship possible, to Dr. Myers for supervising and mentoring my project, to Mary and Svetlana and Caroline and the rest of the Osler Library team for helping me navigate the archives, and as always, to the Del Maestros for getting me introduced to this type of work. So, temperance is an unfamiliar word in our modern lexicon, yet the temperance movement swept through North America only a century ago. Few temperance organizations were as influential as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which did much of its advocacy work with children and adolescents. The WCTU's message, and indeed the message of the temperance movement as a whole, had an inherently evangelical and moralistic tone. However, throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the WCTU launched an intriguing campaign aimed at getting textbooks about anatomy and physiology introduced into Canadian public school curriculum. My research question was then, why did the WCTU need to shed its moral campaign, and why did it turn to science as a framework for temperance? We'll see that the answers to this question lie in the social context of 19th century Canada. I think what we'll also see, and the reason why I chose to focus my project on these archives, is that going through the temperance textbooks is a lot of fun. Their claims often seem a bit outdated and wacky when viewed through our contemporary lens. Nonetheless, I think they teach us some sobering lessons about the juxtaposition between science and morality. So these are my research objectives, which I'm not going to go through. So what was the temperance movement? Well, alcohol was once thought of as a positive entity in Canada, for many reasons, including, for example, that it was safer to drink than the otherwise unsanitary water. These once popular views were replaced by temperance throughout the 19th century's waves of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. Temperance supporters believed that alcohol was the root cause of all social evil, that it prevented economic advances, religious purity, and social cohesion. World War I acted as a catalyst for prohibition, so throughout this time, all Canadian provinces had banned alcohol possession, alcohol sales, and public drinking establishments. The 20s marked the decline of the temperance movement, so prohibition was blamed for halting the economy and for creating organized crime. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the temperance movement's most prominent advocacy groups. So the very first chapter was established in the US, and then the idea was brought to Canada eventually, where the WCTU expanded across all Canadian provinces with a bottom-up approach that favored the creation of hundreds of local chapters. The ideas and motives of the WCTU can be understood through the framework of Christian evangelicalism. Evangelicalism was a dominant religious doctrine throughout the 19th century. And evangelicals believe that their deeply held, visceral beliefs about Christianity should encompass all domains of personal and social life. Canadian society should be organized as a kingdom of God, and this kingdom of God would have at its center the sinless, purified family unit. Evangelical temperance organizations like the WCTU believe that drunkenness destroyed the sanctity of this family unit, and by extension, threatened the sanctity of society as a whole. The WCTU was particularly interested in the relationship between children and God. So they established Sunday school teachings, religious youth groups, and distributed public health pamphlets aimed at young people. Their work with children reflected ideas of moral righteousness, of wickedness, of purity, of the sanctity of the physical body, the holiness of the good Christian family unit, and on and on. So we can see these themes illustrated in the two examples on the slide, the first one from the Bands of Hope youth group, and the second a hymn sung in Sunday schools. And so the strong principled language in these examples shows how the WCTU cast children as evangelizing agents who operated within an entirely moral landscape. So the WCTU's campaign was moral in intent and moral in tone. And in fact, a pretty significant body of scholarship has already looked at the temperance movement's religious and moral basis. So what I wanted to do in my project was look at a more curious, unique facet of the WCTU's work. So throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the Canadian WCTU adopted its American counterparts' interest in getting these textbooks about anatomy and physiology introduced into the public school curriculum. So this work was done under the Departments of Scientific Temperance Instruction, which waged some really aggressive lobbying campaigns of local school boards and legislatures to make sure their books would be approved for official use in the curriculum. One of the very first books used in Canadian schools was written by Benjamin Ward Richardson, an English physician. Then the period from about 1890 to 1920 marked the height of public support for temperance, and accordingly, scores of books were implemented in public schools, including T.C. Allen's book in Nova Scotia and William Natres's book in Ontario and the Northwest Territories. Then, as we spoke about earlier, the 20s marked the decline of temperance. Interestingly, however, the WCTU had a kind of reactionary response and ended up getting a bunch more of their books approved for official use, including Fraser and Porter's book in Ontario, McCorkindale's book in Nova Scotia, and Ritchie and Caldwell's book in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So all of the textbooks that I looked at in my project were organized according to a very similar structure, where they were divided into chapters that were dedicated to the detailed anatomy and physiology of a particular bodily organ. The final paragraph of the chapter would talk about the noxious effects of alcohol on the organ in question. The textbooks were uniform in their use of scientific and medical jargon, and in outlining the objective facts that supported their temperance thesis. So an interesting example of this is the kind of funny debate that recurs in all the textbooks about whether alcohol can be categorized as a scientific food or not. So the textbook authors lay out this question by detailing the anatomy and physiology of the digestive system and by defining a food according to its chemical properties. For example, we see here a detailed diagram of the intestines and the stomach, and on the right, a table of the chemical enzymes that do the work of digestion. And so the language, imagery, and tone of these examples shows how the temperance textbooks really shed the moralistic ideology that we saw in the WCTU's previous youth campaigns. My question then was, why did the Canadian temperance movement need to build a youth campaign that grounded its vision of temperance in science? Why was its robust, moralistic message no longer enough? So the first answer to this question can be obtained by taking a wider view of the question itself and wondering, well, why did the WCTU seek to impose itself in public schools at all, given the strong engagement it already had with children via Sunday schools and youth groups? Throughout the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th, Canadian public education was a haphazard affair, and very few school-age children actually attended class. This became a problem as the Industrial Revolution led to the creation of a more specialized workforce. Public education was now seen as a great opportunity to teach labor skills to all future workers. Plus, with Canadian Confederation looming, a growing sense of nationalism was developing, and it was thought that public education would be a great space in which to mold all young children into the ideal good Canadian. The WCTU and its allies recognized that public schools were now a space in which children would spend a lot of their time and in which they were expected to gain the values and the abilities that would shape their adult lives. So the WCTU realized that public schools were now a space in which they would reach a widest audience, yet they could have easily lobbied for textbooks that aligned themselves with the study of religion or with civic studies rather than with anatomy and physiology. As we'll speak about in a little bit, science was gaining traction as a worldview in the 19th century. Accordingly, science courses were beginning to be implemented within the new government-mandated school curriculum. The purpose of a science education was twofold. On the one hand, because science was gaining in that social and cultural standing, it was thought that learning about science would be crucial to developing these higher-up intellectual skills like logic and problem solving. On the other hand, schools were facing a backlash against traditional classical studies, which were seen as no longer so relevant to life in the industrial world. The layperson now spent most of their life producing commodities, and it was thought that their productivity would increase if they were to, for example, understand the physics that underlied their manufacturing machines. The WCTU recognized this new prerogative and sought to frame its temperance textbooks as essential elements of this new academic culture. We see this idea reflected in the question posed in the Ritchie and Caldwell textbook. They write, quote, "Is alcohol injurious to the body? In the past, there has been a division of opinion on this point. Today, we have come into an age of science, and we are substituting knowledge for guesswork in all fields of human thought," end quote. So the religious and moral effects of alcohol, this so-called guesswork, would no longer be accorded any importance in the new curriculum. If the WCTU wanted to maintain its relevance, it would need to claim some scientific knowledge for itself and distribute it within public school classrooms. So we've now established that throughout the end of the 19th century, science classes were becoming a fixture of a public school education, but we can now wonder, well, why was science gaining the social capital that would allow it such a position? The temperance textbooks situate the science of alcohol primarily within the fields of anatomy and physiology. These disciplines trace their roots back to the ancient Greek era, yet they came into full being during the 19th century. This era was characterized by theoretical advances in bioenergetics and cell function, and in practical advances in vaccination and microscopy. Anatomy and physiology were now recognized as fully fledged domains of science and were integrated within higher-up academia. Their departments closely aligned themselves with medical schools, and the practice of medicine began to ground itself in facts-based science. Towards the end of the 19th century, laboratory science took over the fields of medicine, anatomy, and physiology. Lab experiments conducted within lauded academic institutions became the only valid way to establish new scientific discoveries. The mechanics of science were no longer really accessible to the layperson, and so this led to the creation of a modern cultural figurehead, the scientific or medical expert. If the WCTU wanted to maintain its relevance, it would need to create its own scientific knowledge base. In doing so, the WCTU authors overloaded their textbooks with scientific jargon. A typical explanation of a physiological process reads as follows. This is Natress talking about bones, quote, "This spongy tissue consists of elongated bony cells, and the walls of the cells give lightness and strength, while the tiny channels afford a passage for the nutrient fluid to pass. The blood vessels within the bone are a continuation and subdivision of an artery, which enters the bone through a small opening seen in all bones and called the nutrient foramen," end quote. And so this passage would be almost indecipherable to the elementary school student for whom it was intended. And so it shows that the WCTU had broader objectives than mere pedagogy. It was intent on publishing a voluminous, official-sounding body of work that would prove its ability to conduct research of the same caliber as any reputable scientific organization. With that being said, the WCTU rightly recognized that its materials alone would be subject to much criticism. And so the textbooks rely heavily on quotes from established physicians and physiologists and on already conducted scientific experiments. And so ultimately, what the WCTU wanted to do was to claim the authority that scientists held in the 19th century. This social gravitas would legitimize their message and would justify why temperance deserved to be formally taught to school children. So it's impossible to talk about the emergence of science in the 19th century without also discussing the parallel decline in religion. We've spoken already about the fact that evangelicalism was a dominant doctrine in the 19th century. However, this church was struggling to keep up with the rapid social change brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Towards the end of the century, mainstream evangelicalism sought to address these challenges by realigning itself as social gospel. Social gospelists believed that it was impossible to attain personal salvation if one lived in an unjust, impoverished society. The foundation of their religious theory was social justice reform, so they engaged with ideas of public health, of economic policy, and of medical innovation. So whether the principles of the textbook campaign reflect this more liberal evangelicalism or a more conservative evangelicalism is definitely debatable, but what's obvious is that by the end of the 19th century, the WCTU was necessarily steeped in the social gospel movement. It realized that religious doctrine alone would not be enough to understand and explain the woes of the modern world. The WCTU would keep a religious and evangelical ethos at the core of its organization and would keep up its work with religious youth groups, but it would also need to show children and adolescents that that temperance could align itself with a broader social framework. And science was overtaking religion as a key component of that very framework. 19th century scientific discoveries proved that miracles weren't real, transubstantiation was impossible, and planet Earth was much older than the Bible supposed. The Canadian public now dealt in facts, and it was increasingly obvious that theology did not have many. The WCTU had typically appealed to children by relying on religious motifs and imagery. However, these were losing in cultural symbolism and relevance. The WCTU would need to use scientific facts to tap into a new cultural imagery. For example, Natress writes, quote, "Think of the condition of the poor, unfortunate drunkard. Appetite gone, nausea, vomiting, intense thirst, pain in the head, red eyes, bloated face, coated and red tongue, frequent pulse, and often fever," end quote. So we see here that he's using these really evocative physiological descriptors to conjure up a powerful sense of the importance of temperance. And so a deeper dive into the social and cultural context of the 19th century shows why the WCTU needed to ground its temperance textbook campaign in science and why it could no longer rely solely on a moralizing message based in religion. However, the textbooks are not free of all moralistic inclination. There are dozens and dozens of examples that show the intertwining of scientific facts with moralizing language. If we circle back to our original question about whether alcohol can be considered a food or not, I'm going to just finish my presentation if there's no time for questions or no time. Natress's answer to the question is very telling in this sense. He writes, quote, "No organ or tissue is safe from it. Unless it can be shown that alcohol possesses elements of nutrition or furnishes material for the production of heat, its presence is useless. If useless, it cannot but be harmful. The question, is alcohol a food, can readily be answered. The study of physiology leads to this conviction, and scientific truths cannot be ignored. The absence of anything useful and the burden it places on the powers of nature to cast it out supply safe grounds upon which to declare alcohol a poison to the human system," end quote. And so Natress uses these scientific truths to explain why alcohol is noxious to the body. Yet he goes further than simply outlining the relevant physiological process. He uses these scientific truths to justify a morally tinted judgment of alcohol, that it is a poison and that it is a destructive agent that threatens the holy body's sanctity. And so the WCTU really didn't shed its moralistic message. Rather, it crafted a new, insidious moral campaign that rested on a newfound tone and a newfound rationale, the facts of science. We all know that the process of science is inherently objective and rational, and as it turns out, the science itself within the WCTU textbooks is overall really legitimate and true. And so the textbooks underscore how impartial scientific facts can be instrumentalized to justify subjective moral judgment. This fusion of science and morality is made all the more complex because, as we spoke about earlier, science rests in the hands of experts and professionals. These experts have unquestionable authority over matters of science, and that unquestionable authority subtly extends to the morals they derive from their science. any claim, moral or scientific, made by the WCTU authors was automatically true by virtue of their scientific expertise and couldn't be challenged by their young audience. So in summary, finally, the WCTU's work with children and adolescents was a crucial component of the temperance movement. Much of its work was evangelizing in tone and explicitly moralizing. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the second decade of the 20th, the WCTU waged a fascinating campaign aimed at getting textbooks about anatomy and physiology introduced into the Canadian public school curriculum. I've suggested that the temperance textbook campaign arose from the confluence of three sociocultural currents of the 19th century: the growing importance of public schools and their newly developed science curriculum, the emergence of science as a worldview, and the decline of religion's cultural power. The WCTU realized that its evangelizing message would no longer be as impactful amongst children and adolescents. It would need to adopt the language and the references of science in order to maintain its credibility, and public schools would be an ideal space in which to implement such a campaign. The WCTU also realized the power of appealing to scientific expertise, which would coat its implicitly moralizing messages with a sheen of indisputable legitimacy. And so the temperance textbook campaign was really messy. Although the WCTU waged an aggressive lobbying campaign, there's some research that shows that on a local levels, many school teachers never actually taught from the books. And so while it may be that the temperance textbooks never really taught that much to the students of their time, I think we can draw some contemporary lessons from their pages. The textbooks push us to reflect on how good science might reasonably justify a moral position. This approach is invariably used in any public health campaign, and often maybe for good reason, because some behaviors may very well be wrong or bad. Drinking to excess is bad for many reasons, including the proven scientific fact that it'll cause physiological damage to the body. Where this idea and ideas like it become perilous is when the lay public, and impressionable young children in particular, can no longer challenge a moral claim because they're unable to adequately verify the underlying scientific claim. And so what I hope we draw from the temperance textbooks is this notion that experts should use their knowledge to contribute to public discourse about how science can help all of us define right and wrong. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Megan, for that great presentation. I think we do have time for a question, if anyone has a question. Going once, yeah.
I guess it's probably more of a comment than a question, but first of all, thank you very much. And it actually brought me back to my master's thesis, because I was looking at sort of debates between science and morality in a different aspect. But I think just to point out that there's a lot of this happening at that time, of these questions, how you can sort of leverage science and the objectivity of it, the legitimacy of it. And so I see it here, and the sort of the morality aspect I think is really interesting too, in that debate about how do you apply morality in a case like against, say, scientific objectivity, because you're not supposed to have morality mixing with that. But you also see it actually in things like the early physical education movements too, because they're using science to become legitimate. So I just think it's a really interesting thing you've done here to I think, bring out how they're using science to be legitimate, and also this sort of aspect of science and medicine.
All right, thank you, Megan. So we'll continue on with the next presentation. So our next presentation will be by Reda Hesse. Reda is a first-year medical student with a passion for the humanities, and he's been recognized with provincial and national awards in poetry and philosophy. This summer, he worked under the mentorship of Dr. Stephen Bachman, Dr. Mary Url, and Dr. Noah El-Sherbini on the project Dr. Harold Griffith and Curare Untold Stories, in which he explored Dr. Griffith's pioneering introduction of curare into clinical care using a rich body of correspondence that includes letters recently discovered in the Osler Library. Reda? I'll try to put this for you.
Let's maybe about here. Can you hear me? Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And before starting, I'd like to extend my special thanks to my supervisor, Dr. Stephen Bachman, as well as Dr. Mary Url and Dr. Noel Sherbini for their continued support, as well as to the entire Osler Society, Library, and the Molina Foundation for making this opportunity possible. All right, so today we'll focus on a pioneering figure that many of you may already know, Dr. Harold Griffith, who's a Montreal-born, McGill-trained anesthesiologist who revolutionized anesthesia in the 1940s. Now, for context, before Griffith, there was no effective way to produce muscle relaxation, although it's essential for the course of surgery. So we had to employ dangerously high quantities of anesthetic gases. Griffith introduced an incredibly effective muscle relaxant in the operating room, setting the stage for the modern concept of balanced anesthesia, where we use different drugs with selective actions to produce analgesia, amnesia, muscle relaxation, and unconsciousness. Now, that agent, which would unexpectedly solve the problem of muscle relaxation and change the field forever, is one with quite a sinister history, curare. Now, curare is a plant extract that was historically used as a paralyzing poison by the indigenous peoples of South and Central America, and its stories has fascinated the West for centuries. Now, research in the 1930s opened the door to its entry into anesthesia, notably involving the colorful figure of Richard Gill, who's this American salesman, adventurer, naturalist, who led expeditions into the Amazonian jungle of Ecuador, and thanks to some traditional healers he had befriended, brought back large quantities of curare samples and had detailed knowledge of its preparations. This allowed the American company Squibb & Sons to produce intacostrin, a stable extract of uniform potency, which Dr. Griffith and the resident Enid Johnson used in 25 surgical operations. And they found that it could provide excellent muscle relaxation in a way that was transient and harmless. And they published these results in 1942. Now, Griffith's work faced considerable prejudice in the medical community, probably because of curare's history as a lethal poison, shrouded in mystery, tied to witchcraft. And this skepticism even came from very eminent academic anesthesiologists of the time. And in fact, my supervisor, Dr. Bagman, has recently unearthed a previously unpublished letter from Sir Robert McIntosh of Oxford University, who's actually the first professor of anesthetics outside of America, that really illustrates this. So seemingly in response to Griffith sending him a copy of his article, he replies with a scathing review that was authored by a colleague of his, S.L. Cohen, who's a physiologist. Now, the first paragraph says everything. The paper by Griffith and Johnson seems to be a very unsatisfactory piece of work. Moreover, to have been written in almost complete ignorance or with complete disregard for the extensive and careful work that has been done on pharmacology of curare in the last 70 to 80 years. Now, today, knowing how curare changed the field for the better, this is extremely intriguing. So the point of this project is to dive into curare's incredible history so we can better assess the larger context of this review. To do that, we'll start with the plant source, physiological experiment, chemistry, and therapeutics of curare, moving into its entry in anesthesia, and finishing with its legacy. Now, we have early accounts dating back to 1516 with Pietro Matilde d'Anghiera in his work De Orbe Novo, and we can also think of Charles-Marie de la Condamine, who brought it back to Europe in 745, which is actually often mistakenly attributed to Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, its exact plant source was really mysterious for a long time. We can think of Bancroft in 1769, who identified the nibi, which is kind of this vine. Humboldt, who he gave an early eyewitness account, and he noted that the composition varied depending on where you were in South America, and as well as the botanist Martius, who identified plants from the Menisperm family, and Robert Schomburg, who in 1848 pointed to Strychnos toxifera as a key ingredient in a very potent Macusi curare. So today, we know that there are two big plant families in curare. Strychnos, which is very often mentioned, and also the Condodendron genus from the Menisperm family, which was incredibly important because it included C. tomentosum, and it's actually this species that was brought back in large quantities by Richard Gill, and which was then used to make intacostrin and made its way to the OR. But now, it's the real journey of curare in Western science starts in physiology. So in 1811, Sir Benjamin Brodie is going to keep a poisoned cat alive using artificial respiration and confirms that respiratory paralysis was a lethal mechanism. Charles Waterton is going to replicate this on a donkey in 1814, and he insists that the donkey amusingly lived 25 more happy years after this. So then it continues with the very famous Claude Bernard and his Leçons sur les effets des substances toxiques et médicamenteuses, which laid the groundwork for understanding its effect on neurotransmission. And he's very traditionally credited for identifying the motor end plate as a site of action, although some suggest that Alfred Vulpian, which was a neurologist of the same time, may have also reached that same conclusion. There's also the Swiss physiologist Albert von Kolliker, who made very exhaustive studies on its effect on amphibians, just to say that by the end of that century, we reached the conclusion that curare somehow blocked transmission to striated muscle. As for the chemistry of curare, it starts with Boussingault and Roulin in 1828, who made a syrupy extract of curare containing some unknown alkaloid, which then would be isolated in a crystalline form by Dr. Preyer in 1865, at Claude Bernard's request. Now, in the late 1890s, Rudolf Böhm, who's on the right here, conducts the first very extensive chemical analysis of curare, and is going to categorize it into three categories based on the container. Calabash curare, pot curare, and tube curare, which is basically a bamboo tube. And he thought that each type was associated with specific alkaloids and that he could differentiate them. But this classification, even though it was very widely adopted, would eventually be discredited by Richard Gill, who showed that there was no relation between content and container. Now, in the 1930s over in the UK, the British chemist Harold King will isolate and characterize the compound D-tubocurarine, which is going to be essential to cure's clinical potential. So it was later identified that C-tomentosum, which I mentioned was brought back by Richard Gill and made into costrin, was a stable source of D-tubocurarine. So it could then be made into standardized alkaloids and drugs like tuberin, which would be used in the UK. And this work, which was done in partnership with Sir Henry Dale, would be recognized as a classical exercise in organic chemistry with results of far-reaching importance in pharmacology and therapeutics. Now, bringing us to its medical use, it actually dates way back before Griffith. So throughout the 19th century, curare was used with mixed success to treat conditions like epilepsy, rabies, and especially tetanus, including cases by Vela, Dam, or Bush, who treated soldiers during wars with curare. But overall, survival remained pretty low, probably because there was limited availability and understanding of curare. Now, interestingly, its first use in anesthesia wasn't by Griffith, but it was by Arthur Lowen, which was a German surgeon who used it in 1912. But he noted that it did have incredible muscle relaxation, but due to limited availability, he couldn't really bring this research any forward. Now, research takes off again in the 1930s in the UK with Dr. Reynard West, which is going to treat rigidities with curare, but because of some side effects that he observed, like a bronchospasm, he remains pretty cautious of using it. So now the stage is almost ready for Griffith's work. So in the late 1930s, the American company E.R. Squibb & Sons makes intocostrin from curare samples brought by Richard Gill. It was first used actually in psychiatry by the American doctor A.E. Bennett to prevent fractures because of traumatic muscle contractions in convulsive shock therapy. So seeing these results, Squibb tries to convince leading American anesthesiologists to use curare, but the initial attempts were, well, they weren't very auspicious. As we can see, there's the American anesthesiologists Emery Rovenstein and Emmanuel Papper, much to their dismay, are going to have to ventilate their patients for hours after using curare at a time where prolonged cessation of respiration was considered unsafe, and endotracheal intubation wasn't very common. Dr. Stuart Cullen tested it on dogs first, and he observed cyanosis and profuse salivation, and he just refused to use it in humans. Now, Griffith, however, the hero of our story, was much more receptive, probably because he had a background in homeopathy, and it made him more inclined probably towards plant extracts or drugs used in smaller doses. He also had a lot of expertise in oral intubation, so he was less alarmed by the need for airway support that scared away the rest of his colleagues. So he uses intocostrin successfully in 25 abdominal surgeries and notes incredible relaxation, little side effects, it's very transient, and here publishes these revolutionary findings in 1942. Now, the article itself is this very elegantly brief 2-page work with no objective endpoints or ethics review or patient consent, but he does urge caution. In the years that followed this publication, intocostrin would be applied throughout North America, including by the very S.C. Cullen, who refused to use it originally, and who reportedly, when he saw Griffith's paper, cursed luridly and reached into his desk and immediately started using it. So in 1945, Harold Griffith will reflect on his own work, and he says that the experience, ability, and judgment of the anesthetist are more important than any new agent or method, and I believe that curare should just remain as just one more good thing in the modern anesthetist's bag of tricks. It is not a plaything for the inexperienced. Now, across the pond, over in the UK, the response was mixed, and its introduction was somewhat delayed because it only really started in 1946 when Drs. T.C. Gray and Halton present curare and their results in anesthesia in front of the Royal Society of Medicine. Now, Gray himself, who actually championed using curare in the UK, was very critical of intocostrin that was used in North America because he thought, like many other British anesthetists, that this was just a crude, impure preparation, and he much preferred using Burroughs Wellcome's preparation of tuberin, which was made by pure alkaloids like D2-curare. Intocostrin was actually indeed a little less potent than tuberin, but since it was much more available in North America, Americans and Canadians preferred using it. Now, Gray eventually recognizes the genius of Griffith's work and promotes balanced anesthesia, concluding that old ideas must give way to the new. This brings us back to Mackintosh. So as reflected by the scathing review, which he made with Cohen, he was initially skeptical of curare. And his criticism was based on the idea that Griffith's results were just based on impurities in intocostrin and were probably not reproducible. Nevertheless, we have evidence that by 1945, he had used it in more than 100 cases, and letters that were found in a Wellcome collection actually show that as early as 1943, even with that review, he was already planning clinical trials using curare. And we also found a correspondence that he sent directly to Griffith, saying that quite a lot of chaps over here are using curare now, and I think you put us on to something really good. Now, curare's limited availability in the UK was kind of challenging, and Mackintosh had to deal with that, and we also found a letter from Mackintosh to Griffith where he tells him that Burroughs Wellcome is running out, and please put me in touch with Squibb for more intocostrin, which he eventually receives. Now, Mackintosh will finally conclude that the introduction of curare into anesthetics has been a dramatic development. Rarely has a drug been promoted from the experimental stage to everyday clinical use so unexpectedly as curare. Never did a drug have a more evil history to live down, yet at the moment, little but its virtues are discussed. After a stagnant period of nearly 100 years as a pharmacological laboratory tool to immobilize a conscious animal, it suddenly has become an anesthetic necessity. Now, this discovery will catapult Griffith into worldwide fame, and he's elected as the inaugural president of the World Federation of Societies of Anesthesiologists. But never mind that, he still remains he has remarkable humility, and he described this as this fortunate and fortuitous event, crediting all the other people that worked on it, and just saying that his only contribution was recognizing that it could be used in anesthesia. And he also advises future anesthesiologists in a lecture in 1967 not to be swept away by the glamour of new operations to the point of neglecting the importance of doing commonplace work with care, skill, and kindness. Now, despite an early critique of Griffith's work, Sir Robert Mackintosh actually was friends with Griffith, as we saw in letters that we found in the 60s and 70s. They frequently exchanged, they talked about their families, travels, they praised each other, saying that, for instance, that Griffith would have been a baron if the Canadian government hadn't given up on that, and Mackintosh letting Griffith know of his plans to drink himself to death during his retirement. There's also stories about how Griffith's grandson went to visit the Mackintoshes, and that in 1986, when Griffith died, Mackintosh contributed to endowing a chair in his name as a testament to their friendship. Now, to conclude, Griffith's introduction of curare into anesthesia was a bold innovation, and it challenged established norms and long-standing prejudices. As Mackintosh himself remarks to Griffith in 1945, this just shows you that expert opinion, valuable as it is at times, is not always right. This story highlights the unpredictable nature and often the sinuous path of scientific progress, as well as the human relationships that shape it behind the scenes. Again, thank you so much for the Molina Foundation for giving me this opportunity. And are there any questions?
open for questions.
Please.
Yeah. Let me just bring you the microphone.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether you considered arguing or discussing Curare and how it was brought to the West from the colonial context. Like, are you thinking of putting it into that context? And you mentioned, for example, Griffith and his humble lecture. And did he give credit to indigenous wisdom in that? If not, can we really call him humble? And like you mentioned also the critique of use of curare, especially in the early days. Can we also think about that within the colonial context?
Hold on.
Yeah, thank you. It's an amazing point that I probably should have brought up. But yeah, during the early days, it was really embedded in the colonial context. As we know, the first stories really came from explorers and colons, just bringing back curare, kind of just, oh, look at what these tribes are using. So it was rooted in colonialism at some point. Now, as for Griffith himself, I don't have, from my reading in the lecture, he does mention the witch doctors, and he mentions that this is where it ultimately comes from. But then again, I'm not sure if he necessarily gives as much credit to their ingenuity in discovering curare as he does maybe to the later workers. But it's something that would be worth even analysis and going back over.
Any other questions?
Just to add a point. Richard Gill, I don't need the microphone. I've got a
I think it's for this.
Okay. Just to add a point, Richard Gill, whose work was written up, how he procured it from the Amazon jungle in Whitewater Black Magic, he is very deferential to the indigenous people and is extremely in awe of many of the things that they had, and it's actually written quite in a modern way, quite sympathetically.
Great, and I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. Thank you. You mentioned the intriguing connection between Dr. Griffiths and homeopathy, and I wonder what that connection means to his work and what kind of background it provided for Griffiths' work as an anesthesiologist.
Yeah, it's also a great question. I'm not all that familiar with a specific background in homeopathy, but the kind of analysis that we had reached would be that, in a sense, the fact that he was kind of well-versed in homeopathy it just made him a little bit more open than the other specialists to using something that was made from a plant extract. And also because about using the doses, there weren't necessarily too much literature talking about how much intocostrine he's supposed to use in the OR. And maybe because of that background, he purposefully chose very low quantities of intocostrine, and it turned out that this allowed him to have that relaxation without the side effects. So in a sense, I think it eventually served them.
All right, thank you, Retta.
Thank you so much.
All right, so we've come to the last presentation of the evening for the Molina Foundation Awards by Amina Mustaqim Barrett. So Amina is a third-year medical student. She previously studied and worked in epidemiology in British Columbia, but she's now returned to Montreal for medical school. She is keenly interested in exploring issues related to the social determinants of health and health advocacy, which she will present with her presentation here entitled Dr. Thomas Hodgkin and the Legacy of British Empire on Canada's Indigenous Peoples. Amina, you're up.
Hello, that works? Yeah, great. Okay, hello. I'm gonna try not to touch this too much. So again, my name is Amina, and the title of my presentation and paper is Dr. Thomas Hodgkin and the Legacy of British Empire on Canada's Indigenous Peoples. I was supervised by Dr. Marvin Stone and Dr. Rolando Del Maestro. So a quick overview of this presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got to this topic. Then I'll give a short introduction to the life and career of Dr. Thomas Hodgkin. I wanted to give an understanding of the events that led to Dr. Hodgkin's retirement from medicine, and then provide a brief analysis of the implications of Dr. Hodgkin's advocacy and how it's relevant to us today. So why did I start reading about Dr. Thomas Hodgkin? Of course, like all of you, when I hear the name, I think of Hodgkin's lymphoma. I first learned more about the disease in my first year of medical school. This is a slide on the left from that lecture. And in passing, the pathologist who was teaching us, Dr. René Michel, had mentioned that Dr. Thomas Hodgkin, as well as being a pathologist, was a very well-known social activist. So in that lecture hall, I started to Google him, and I discovered a very interesting and varied life. So Hodgkin, who was he? He was born in 1798 and died in 1866. He was born to a devout Quaker family, and his faith guided his actions throughout his life. For those who don't know too much about Quakerism, it's really founded in the concept of human rights, and human rights being an extension of the belief that God is in everyone. They're advocates for pacifism and for equal treatment of all people. So he started writing about kind of human rights and humanitarianism very early in his life. At 21, he penned an essay called Essay on the Promotion of Civilization. And this was at the height of kind of British colonial empire. And in that essay, at 21 years old, he provided a really scathing critique of British Empire. He, along with his interest in humanitarianism, studied at Edinburgh University, and he studied medicine there before beginning a very prolific career at Guy's Hospital in London, where he spent 12 years. So at Guy's Hospital, Dr. Hodgkin became the first lecturer in morbid anatomy. He penned many, many lectures on anatomy, on pathology. His lectures on the morbid anatomy of the serous and mucous membranes are available through the Osler Library. And these were really pioneering works of pathology. It's what led to the discovery of Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he performed hundreds and hundreds of autopsies at Guy's Hospital. And it's important to say too that Hodgkin was deeply devoted to Guy's Hospital. He was really interested in the promotion of the institution, as well as his own career. He really valued his work and was proud of his work there. So what happened for Hodgkin to leave Guy's Hospital in London? So in 1837, Hodgkin presented himself for the position of assistant physician, but he was denied the promotion by Mr. Benjamin Harrison. And a little side note that there are a lot of characters in this story. I tried to keep it to the most important people, but Mr. Benjamin Harrison was the hospital treasurer at Guy's Hospital, and he was also the Hudson's Bay's company director. There were 7 directors that sat on the Hudson's Bay's company, and he was one of 7. And the HBC controlled much of modern-day Canada at the time. You can see in this map, that was the entire territory controlled by Hudson's Bay, and they had exclusive rights to trading in Canada with the Indigenous peoples. So all that to say, he was a big boss both at Guy's Hospital and at the HBC. So he allegedly, in writings about Hodgkin's life, blocked Hodgkin's promotion to the position of assistant physician because Hodgkin was critiquing Hudson's Bay's company and the treatment of Indigenous people. So the goal of the project for me was to understand the link between Hodgkin and the Canadian Indigenous people, where these critiques were coming from, to contextualize what was happening in this time, in the time of kind of British colonial empire, and then also to speak more about the relevance to today. So Hodgkin as I mentioned, was interested in humanitarianism throughout his life. And he wasn't only interested in the plight of Canadian Indigenous people, but of Indigenous people across the globe. He wrote about Indigenous people in Australia, New Zealand, British North America, and South Africa. And before 1837, he did a lot of work to collect information about the British Empire and its activities in these places. So he was collecting information, documenting issues related to land dispossession, and he was going to use that to kind of lobby the British authorities. So in 1837, when he had collected enough information, he founded the Aborigines Protection Society, which I'll refer to as the APS. And he founded this with other Quakers of conscience and other British citizens that were opposing British colonialism. So in terms of colonial activities in Canada specifically, where was Hodgkin getting his information, given that he hadn't done an expedition to Canada himself? Mostly it came from Dr. Richard King. So Dr. Richard King was a doctor, a surgeon at Guy's Hospital with Hodgkin, a good friend of his. And he made a journey to North America in 1833, 34, and 35, and wrote about his journey in a narrative of a journey to the shores of the Arctic Ocean. And in this narrative, he really describes horrific scenes related to Canadian Indigenous people. He describes practices like the Indigenous communities having to leave their elders behind to die as a result of food scarcity and pressures from colonial trading, and other really kind of horrific scenes that he describes in detail. And in one of his letters to Dr. Hodgkin, King notes that the HBC policies contributed directly to Indigenous suffering. Again, HBC was in control of almost the entire territory of Canada. And in his letter, he says that as long as the Hudson's Bay Company exists, the noble race, being the Indigenous people, must remain in status quo. So essentially, there will be no improvement of Indigenous communities as long as the HBC is active. So with this information, Dr. Hodgkin directly appealed to Mr. Harrison because he had a personal relationship with him at Guy's Hospital, and because obviously Mr. Harrison sat on the board of the HBC and had direct influence on their policies. So he appealed to them and cited King's observations, calling for humane treatment of Indigenous peoples. In his letters to Harrison, he's very direct, very stern. This is how Hodgkin was described in his biographies. He was a very principled person, very stoic, didn't mince words. So in his letters, he described what Dr. King had described to him in terms of worsening conditions. And obviously, as you can imagine, Harrison did not take this well. In regards to Hodgkin's promotion, and this was all happening kind of in the same time, in the same year actually, in regards to the promotion, Mr. Harrison was said to he was said to have said that it was that he would have no officer of the hospital who drove about with a North American Indian, referring to Hodgkin. So what North American Indians was Hodgkin driving about with? This was a big question for me. There were multiple people that Hodgkin was in contact with and had correspondences with, but one of his main colleagues in correspondences was with Reverend Peter Jones. He was an Indigenous Methodist minister who's advocating for land rights in Canada. Jones had sought the APS to support him to secure land titles in Upper Canada for his community when he had heard what the APS was doing. And Jones and Hodgkin actually became very good friends. They have many correspondences between them. There are many journal entries from Jones about his trips to the UK and breakfasts with Dr. Hodgkin. So they became long and good collaborators. In the paper, I'm also interested in kind of discovering the concrete impacts that the APS had on British colonial policy. So essentially, when Hodgkin was passed out for promotion, he resigned from Guy's Hospital because he didn't want to stay in the position. He felt that he deserved the promotion, as did many of his colleagues. So he resigned, but he remained an advocate for Indigenous rights across the world. And while it's hard to say exactly what concrete implication the APS had on British policy, it likely did have an important impact. One of the characters in the story is Sir Augustus Deste, who was a member of APS and a good friend of both Peter Jones and Thomas Hodgkin. And Sir Augustus Deste was actually the first cousin of Queen Victoria, and he would help lobby the Colonial Office on the APS's behalf. And the APS continued its efforts for over 70 years. So the legacy of Dr. Hodgkin is kind of the last part of my paper is kind of thinking through how this applies to today. So Dr. Hodgkin would stop being a physician. He died in Jaffa, Palestine in 1866 on a humanitarian mission there. Essentially, in medical school, we're taught that the role of health advocate is kind of one of the central tenets of being a physician. And through my reading, I really felt that Hodgkin exemplified that role. And that he reflects kind of our moral responsibility as physicians to advocate for the patients that we have. And it also, through this paper and reading about Hodgkin's advocacy, it brings into question, what progress have we made for Indigenous human rights here and around the world? As we all know, Indigenous populations here continue to have higher rates of chronic illness, a shorter life expectancy, reduced healthcare access. So in the almost 200 years between when Hodgkin founded the APS and now, there's still much work to be done, and I think the physician's role is significant in that. And his story also reminds us that medicine is a moral vocation, not just a science, and it's incumbent upon us to think of the moments where we've been silent in the face of injustice because of perceived personal or professional cost, which I think happens quite often. And Hodgkin, I think, is kind of a shining example of speaking truth to power, no matter what the cost might be on his career, which was significant. I wanted to mention my references a bit because the previous biographers of Thomas Hodgkin really led kind of the way of this project. Dr. Marvin Stone is one of them. I had read his paper on Dr. Thomas Hodgkin early on, and it really helped me kind of navigate which characters might be important or where to look. So I'm very thankful for those who have done the work before me. And just a big thank you to Dr. Molina for making this possible, Dr. Del Maestro and Dr. Stone for agreeing to supervise my project, and Dr. Urel for kind of maintaining the library and humanities and medicine. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amina. Wait, stay up here, just in case. Questions, anybody? Oh, yeah, you're allowed to drink.
That was wonderful, Amina, and this is for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love this book.
Questions, anyone?
I mean, clearly he decided that he was going to no longer work at Guy's Hospital. But do you think, looking back on the rest of his career, would it have been more, let's say, important for him to continue to work at Guy's Hospital, let's say, and continue to his work, trying to do the various things in a position of some type of power, rather than really giving away that whatever power he may have had in his position? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question because I feel like that's the compromise that a lot of people make in this day and age too, is to kind of tamper their views or their principles to maintain some power and influence and try to kind of work within the system. I agree. I mean, I have actually thought about this question a lot in kind of life, and I agree that there is something to be said about kind of maintaining your position in order to be able to action change instead of kind of going all out on your principles and kind of blowing everything up because you're so principled. I don't think that there is a right answer, though. I think that he kind of throughout his life seemed to have done things that he thought were right and kind of was guided by his morals. And I think it's really respectable and a principled way of going about life. It's maybe not the most strategic way, but I'm definitely, I find that I'm not a very strategic person. So I really relate to the way that he goes about his life and just kind of says what he feels and deals with the consequences later. So I don't know. Show us your book. Oh, yes. It's Perfecting the World. It's one of my references for the paper too.
Another question?
It's actually very related to what Dr. Del Mastro was asking, but I also think a lot about how one leverages what power one has individually. And I think about the fact that one can, depending on one's circumstances, you can take a stand or not. So I was just wondering actually about his own circumstances. Sometimes you can afford to lose your job because, you're not going to be on the streets or things like that if you think in a modern context. So what did he have to go back on, or did he have support of the Quakers, the Society of Friends or things like that? How could he afford to take a stand and still actually have a career and an impact?
Sorry.
Yeah, it's a really good question. From what I remember, he wasn't from a super kind of high socioeconomic status background, but he was from a kind of well off enough in terms of that society. So I guess he did have kind of his family to fall back on. I think he led a very simple life otherwise, so he didn't really need to do all that much. And he continued to work a bit. He worked after Guy's Hospital, actually caring for people of low socioeconomic status. So I think he continued to work now and then, but then traveled. Oh yeah, and then when he traveled to Palestine, he actually traveled as kind of like a personal assistant, personal doctor to a traveler. So he kind of resigned his official medical position, but I think still, I'm not sure how payment was done back then, but I think was able to still care for himself. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Amina. So, just to finish things up, I'd like to once again thank our three speakers this evening, Megan, Reda, and Amina, for their thought-provoking presentations. I'd like to thank their mentors for helping them on their journeys in the medical humanities. Thank Dr. Molina, Dr. Del Maestro, Pam Del Maestro, to thank Dr. Ural and Svetlana for making this night possible. And now it is, I think, just about 5:40. Yeah, just about 5:40. So in 20 minutes, the 47th Osler Lectureship will start by Dr. Kneebone up in the Meekins Amphitheater. That's room 521 on the 5th floor. So we invite you all to come join us there. In the meantime, 20 minutes to mingle, have another drink, and we'll see you upstairs. Thank you all.